September 1941. A mother sits silently in her apartment. The room is cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you pull a blanket closer. The kind that creeps into your bones and refuses to leave. She looks at the small piece of bread in her hands. It weighs less than a smartphone, yet it is the most valuable thing she owns. Across the room, her son stares at it. His eyes never leave the bread. Neither of them speaks, because both know the terrible truth. Only one of them can eat it. This was not a scene from a horror movie. This was real. This was the city of Leningrad. And for nearly 900 days, millions of people would be trapped inside a nightmare, unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. A nightmare of hunger. A nightmare of freezing cold. A nightmare where survival itself became a daily battle. This is the story of the city that refused to die. This is the story of the Siege of Leningrad. And trust me, it only gets worse from here. To understand this story, we need to go back to June 22nd, 1941. The sun had barely risen when one of the largest military invasions in human history exploded into action. Thousands of German tanks rolled across the Soviet border. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies. More than 3 million soldiers surged forward. The operation was called Operation Barbarossa. Its goal was simple: destroy the Soviet Union, fast. At first, everything seemed to go according to plan. German forces advanced at terrifying speed. Entire Soviet armies disappeared. Cities fell one after another. Roads became clogged with refugees desperately fleeing west. For Adolf Hitler, victory seemed inevitable. But there was one city he desperately wanted: Leningrad. Today, we know it as St. Petersburg. Back then, it was one of the most important cities in the Soviet Union. It was a major industrial center, a cultural treasure, and perhaps most importantly, it carried the name of Vladimir Lenin himself. Capturing it would be a devastating psychological blow. Hitler wanted the city erased, not occupied, not negotiated with, erased. His plans for Leningrad were horrifying. Instead of capturing its population, German leaders planned to surround the city and let its inhabitants starve. As German forces advanced, panic spread across Leningrad. People listened nervously to radio broadcasts. Rumors spread through streets and apartment buildings. Would the Germans reach the city? Could the Soviet army stop them? Nobody knew, but everyone feared the answer. Factories suddenly switched production. Workers who had been making household items now built weapons. Teenagers dug defensive trenches. Teachers became laborers. Office workers carried sandbags. The entire city transformed into a giant fortress. One resident later recalled that people worked almost non-stop. The city was preparing for a battle that everyone hoped would never come. But deep down, most knew it was coming. Then the bombs arrived. German aircraft appeared overhead. Sirens screamed. Explosions echoed across neighborhoods. Black smoke climbed into the sky. For many citizens, it was the first time they'd experienced war, and it was terrifying. One moment you were drinking tea. The next moment your entire street was shaking. One moment you were walking to work. The next moment bombs were falling from the sky. Life was changing rapidly, and it was only the beginning. September 8th, 1941. A date that would become infamous. German forces captured the town of Schlisselburg. To many people outside the region, that name meant nothing. To the people of Leningrad, it meant everything. Because with its capture, the final land route into the city was cut. Leningrad was now surrounded. The siege had begun. Inside the city were approximately 3 million people. Among them were hundreds of thousands of children. And suddenly, they were trapped. Imagine waking up and discovering that every road leading out of your city had been cut off. No escape, no easy supply routes, no certainty about tomorrow. That was the reality facing Leningrad, yet many people remained strangely optimistic. After all, surely the siege would end soon. Surely help would arrive. Surely the Soviet army would break through. Surely things couldn't get much worse. History would prove them horribly wrong. Then disaster struck. A disaster that would haunt the city for months. German bombing raids hit several warehouses known as the WWII food stores. Huge fires erupted. Flames consumed enormous quantities of food supplies. Smoke filled the sky. Citizens watched in horror. Some stood frozen, others cried. Many understood immediately what this meant. Food was already becoming scarce. Now a large portion of the city's reserves had gone up in flames. Panic began spreading. People rushed to shops. Queues grew longer. Arguments became common. The fear was no longer about bombs. The fear was hunger. And hunger is a different kind of enemy. You cannot hide from it. You cannot negotiate with it. It follows you everywhere. Morning, afternoon, night, always waiting, always growing stronger. At first, the changes were subtle. Bread portions became smaller. Meals became simpler. People complained but adapted. Then the shortages became impossible to ignore. November 1941, the cold had arrived, and it was merciless. Temperatures continued to drop lower and lower. The city's food reserves were nearly exhausted. But the weather was only half the problem. The real enemy was hunger. Every day, food rations were reduced, and then reduced again and again, until finally the unthinkable happened. For many civilians, the daily bread ration shrank to a tiny amount. People stared at their bread as if it were gold. Some divided it into tiny pieces, hoping to make it last longer. Others hid part of it from themselves, afraid they would eat it all at once. One woman later wrote that she spent hours simply looking at her bread before eating it. She wanted to make the moment last. Imagine being so hungry that eating a small piece of bread becomes the highlight of your entire day. That was now life in Leningrad. Something strange began happening. The city was becoming quieter, not because the bombing had stopped, but because people were running out of energy. Walking became difficult. Talking became difficult. Even thinking became difficult. Workers dragged themselves to factories. Children stopped playing. Conversations became shorter. Every movement felt like work. People lost weight at alarming rates. Faces became thinner. Eyes sank deeper. Clothes hung loosely from shrinking bodies. The city was starving, and everyone knew it. Yet somehow, life continued. Factories continued producing weapons. Hospitals continued treating patients. Firefighters continued responding to emergencies. The city refused to surrender, but survival was becoming harder every day. Then another disaster struck. Electricity began failing. Heating systems stopped working. Water pipes froze. Many apartments became iceboxes. People woke up to find frost covering the walls. Imagine waking up inside your own home and seeing your breath in the air. Imagine trying to sleep while wearing multiple layers of clothing. Imagine realizing that your bedroom is almost as cold as the street outside. That became normal. Families burned furniture for warmth. Books disappeared into fireplaces. Wooden shelves vanished. Chairs vanished. Tables vanished. Anything that could burn became fuel. One resident joked that eventually his apartment became easier to clean because there was no furniture left. For a moment, people laughed. Then they remembered why the furniture was gone, and the laughter faded. By December, the streets looked different. People moved slowly, very slowly. Many could barely walk. Some pulled sleds behind them. Not because they were transporting supplies, because they were transporting loved ones. The sight became tragically common. A sled, a blanket, a silent figure beneath it. No words, no tears. Just another family trying to cope with unimaginable loss. The city that had once been full of life now looked like a shadow of itself. Yet despite everything, the people kept moving. One step, then another, because stopping could mean never getting up again. Among the millions trapped in Leningrad was a young girl named. She was just a child. Like many children, she kept a diary. But her diary was different. It did not contain stories about school or friends or dreams. Instead, page after page recorded terrible losses. One family member after another, gone, then another, gone, then another, gone. The diary was short, only a few pages. Yet those pages would become one of the most heartbreaking symbols of the siege, because they captured the suffering of an entire city through the eyes of a child. And sadly, her story was not unique. Thousands of families were experiencing similar tragedies. By now, many outside observers expected Leningrad to collapse. How could it not? The city was starving, freezing, under attack. cut off from the war, realizing that this city was not behaving as planned. Leningrad was supposed to die quietly. Instead, it continued resisting, and that resistance would soon inspire one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of World War II. As winter tightened its grip, Soviet leaders desperately searched for a solution. The city needed food. The city needed fuel. The city needed hope. There was only one possible route, a vast body of water known as Lake Ladoga. During warmer months, crossing it was dangerous enough, but now winter was freezing the lake solid. At first glance, this seemed like another disaster. Then someone realized something. If the ice became thick enough, vehicles might be able to cross it. It sounded insane. Driving trucks across a frozen lake, in the middle of a war, under enemy attack? Many believed it would never work. Soon they would find out, because the frozen lake was about to become Leningrad's lifeline, a route that history would remember as the Road of Life. And for thousands of drivers preparing to make that journey, the most dangerous part of the story was still ahead. Picture this. It is the middle of winter. The temperature is far below freezing. You are sitting behind the wheel of a truck loaded with desperately needed food. Beneath your tires is not a road, not concrete, not gravel, ice, miles and miles of ice. Above you, enemy aircraft patrol the skies. Ahead of you waits an entire starving city. Behind you waits safety. In front of you waits danger. And one mistake could send your truck crashing through the frozen surface into the dark water below. Yet despite the risk, the drivers kept going, because millions of lives depended on them. In the next chapter of our story, we will follow those brave drivers onto the road of life. A journey through bombs, blizzards, and frozen death. A journey that would determine whether Leningrad lived or finally disappeared from the map forever. Winter had transformed Lake Ladoga into a frozen wilderness. Across that vast sheet of ice lay the only hope for Leningrad: food, fuel, medicine, life itself. The Soviet authorities organized convoys of trucks to cross the frozen lake. It sounded simple. Drive across the ice, deliver supplies, return safely. But there was one problem. Nothing about this mission was safe. Drivers faced enemy aircraft, artillery fire, blizzards, and perhaps most terrifying of all, the ice itself. Too fast and the vibrations could crack the frozen surface. Too slow and enemy aircraft could easily target you. Many drivers traveled at night. Headlights often remained off. Imagine driving a heavy truck across a frozen lake in darkness while carrying supplies for a starving city. One wrong move, one crack, one moment of bad luck, and both truck and driver could vanish beneath the ice forever. Yet night after night, they continued. Because every truck that arrived meant more people would survive another day. Soon the route became known by a name that perfectly described its purpose, the Road of Life. The name sounds inspiring, almost heroic, but the reality was terrifying. Drivers often witnessed trucks ahead of them disappear into the frozen water. Some saw aircraft swoop down from the clouds. Others battled blinding snowstorms. Many never returned, yet the road remained open. Food slowly began reaching the city. Not enough to end the suffering, but enough to keep hope alive. Children were evacuated. Civilians were transported to safety. Supplies entered. People left. The frozen lake became a lifeline connecting Leningrad to the outside world. Without it, the city may not have survived. But even with the Road of Life, the struggle was far from over. As months passed, something remarkable happened. The people of Leningrad adapted. Not because conditions improved, because they had no choice. Factories continued operating. Workers continued producing tanks, ammunition, and weapons. Musicians continued performing. Artists continued creating. Teachers continued teaching. Life persisted. One famous story involved the performance of a symphony inside the starving city. Many musicians were weak from hunger. Some had died. Others were barely strong enough to play. Yet the performance went ahead. The music echoed through the city. Loudspeakers carried it into the streets. Even German positions outside the city reportedly heard the concert. It was more than music. It was a message. Leningrad was still alive, and it was not giving up. By 1943, the war was changing. The German advance had stalled. The Soviet Union was beginning to fight back. Across the Eastern Front, fierce battles were turning the tide. And finally, help was approaching Leningrad. Soviet forces launched major offensives. The fighting was brutal. Thousands of soldiers died. But slowly, painfully, the German grip began to weaken. For the first time in a long time, there was genuine hope. Not survival for another week. Not survival for another month. Hope that the siege itself might end. After nearly 2 years of suffering, that possibility felt almost unbelievable. But the impossible was becoming reality. January 1944. The moment finally arrived. Soviet forces broke the siege. The German encirclement collapsed. The nightmare was over. After nearly 900 days. After unimaginable suffering. After hunger, cold, bombs, and death. Leningrad was free. The news spread through the city. People celebrated. People cried. People embraced one another. Many could hardly believe it. For so long, survival had been the only goal. Now the siege was finished. But victory came with a terrible cost. Every street carried memories. Every neighborhood carried scars. Almost every family had lost someone. The city had survived. But it would never be the same again. Historians still debate the exact numbers. But one thing is certain. The human cost was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Some estimates place the civilian death toll at well over 1 million. Most were not killed by bullets. Most were not killed by bombs. They died from hunger, cold, disease, exhaustion. The siege became one of the deadliest events in modern history. A tragedy almost impossible to comprehend. Yet despite everything, the city survived. That is why the story of Leningrad remains extraordinary. Not because it avoided suffering, but because it endured suffering on a scale few places ever have, and still refused to surrender. Think back to the mother and child from the beginning of our story. The tiny piece of bread, the freezing apartment, the impossible choice. For millions of people, survival was never guaranteed. Every day brought new dangers. Every day demanded courage. Many did not make it, but many did, and because they endured, the world remembers their story. The Siege of Leningrad was not simply a military campaign. It was a test of human endurance, a test of hope, a test of the human spirit. And against all odds, the city passed. Nearly 900 days. One of the darkest chapters of World War II. One of the greatest stories of survival in human history. The city was surrounded. The city was starving. The city was freezing. The city was breaking. But the city never surrendered. It became known forever as the city that refused to die. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to Real Story Network, because history is more than dates and battles. History is people, their struggles, their courage, and the stories that must never be forgotten.